All right, next on the docket, the penalty phase when it comes to the Boston bomber trial. Prosecutors, they want the death penalty for Tsarnaev, and they say he remains unrepentant. But many families, even with all the powerful testimony, those family members of victims, they want life in prison for him instead. And that includes the parents of Martin Richard. Martin was the 8-year-old that was killed in the bombing. In an open letter published in the Boston Globe, they made their case. In part, they said, we know that the government has its reason for seeking the death penalty, but the continued pursuit of that punishment could bring years of appeals and prolong reliving the most painful days of our lives. So I guess the question, guys, is, and I'll start with you, Doug, if the families don't want death, should that factor into the judge's and the jury's decision?
I would say yes. I mean, listen, it comes down to whether you believe in the death penalty or not. I mean, but if the family is certainly saying they don't want to do it, it would further give them grief and uncomfort if this happens. Why would you be pursuing it? I mean, I don't understand.
I hear it. Let me play devil's advocate, Mark, though, and say, if a victim said, you know what, I forgive the person for a horrific crime, our judicial system doesn't say, okay, he can go. It's a mitigating factor, but how much of one should it be?
Zero, I think. The Federal Death Penalty Act sets out procedures and standards and rules of admissibility of evidence. And we're not trying the case in the press. You have the jury as the representative of the community that's been appointed to enact the community's will. And we're not trying it based on the media. We're trying it based on the evidence that will come in during the penalty phase. And the statute and the judge will give instructions. It's not a seat of the pants or a gut decision. It's based on the evidence and the statutory factors.
Because it was out there, and the jury's going to have to weigh, obviously, a life and death decision. If you're the prosecutor in the case, do you acknowledge the elephant in the room and say, listen, I know some families and some of the victims have said they believe life imprisonment, but this is why we believe in the prosecutor's office here that the death penalty is right. Do you acknowledge what the other families want or not?
If you're really trying to get the death penalty, you probably don't, because at that point you're softening your argument. You probably simply make the argument as to why the death penalty is appropriate. But if you really look at the death penalty and we take a step back objectively, it's generally reserved for the people who are poor, people who have committed particular crimes. It's not applied evenly across the board, and there's a political element there. And again, I have friends who've lost loved ones on September 11th, and they were against the death penalty. I think that clearly they should have a voice in terms of whether that occurs. And you should also listen to the family members who are in favor of the death penalty.
But that's a policy argument.
Well, but it ought to be,
right? Shouldn't he have made this decision when they sent it to Washington to decide whether it's going to be a death case?
But that's a political determination again, and there are lots of other people equally eligible for the death penalty who will never be facing the death penalty. And you can even look at some of the cases involving police shootings where clearly the person's in handcuffs and they're on a train platform, and no one's ever talking about the death penalty in state or federal court. So when we get
where were these victims' families when they went down to Washington to make the decision?
I think that's important, because there is a process here where when it's a death-eligible case, the case is made down in DOJ as to whether or not the death penalty should be sought.
Right.
And that's where the voices of these families should have been heard and presented loud and clear. But I agree that their voice here should be heard as well. It's unspeakable tragedy, unspeakable agony, and what they're saying is we don't want any more of it. And I think that it is something that should be heard.
Yeah, but the whole community theoretically was victimized. I mean, the marathon was victimized. The police officers afterwards.
I
don't
think
it's
not equally. The whole community is not equally victimized.
Your 3-year-old child, a 5-year-old child.
You can't say that someone who's in Kansas is victimized the same as someone who lost a loved one in September 11th. They're victimized, yes, but not to the same degree. So at some point, nobody takes particular ownership of it, but they should certainly be heard.
There is also the concept of jury nullification. This is a jury, and the jury gets to do what they want to do at the end of the day. Regardless, the government sometimes doesn't want to hear that, but that's true. They can do whatever they want. And if they hear from the family, and the family says, listen, I don't want this to happen. I don't care what this is going to be bad for me. The jury should hear that, and they should have the option of doing what they...
You make the point about the jury decides. Not necessarily in every case here. We have 3 different states in this country, including in Alabama, where a judge overruled a jury who gave life in prison, instead gave the guy the death penalty. He was convicted of killing an Auburn student. The judge says he did this because the family wanted the guy killed by the state. So here we have a situation when I first read it, I took it to meaning, oh, this was some bloodthirsty jury, and the judge said, you know, I'm sorry, you know, this isn't going to work here, life in prison. It's the other way. Why bother having a jury if the judge decides unilaterally, you know what, I don't care what you guys say, I want the death penalty, and said, again, because the family's wishes were different.
Or the community.
3 different states, Florida, Alabama, I'm sorry, I forget the third, but my point is, Delaware, excuse me. To me, that was shocking. Judges overruling juries. What's the whole point of even having a jury if you're not going to let their decision stand?
And if you're going to do that, you're wasting the jury's time. Let them go. And the other thing is, though, that clearly is when politics kicks in, because especially where you have elected judges, those people are thinking, how is this going to play when I run down the road? So I want to be able to say, hey, I'm tough, I gave the death penalty.
It's more than that. In Alabama, it's not only elected judges, they're elected on it's a partisan judicial election. So, you know, you've got judges running and belonging to certain parties. That's right. That's right.
Well, we have the same thing here. It's just maybe it's not quite as pronounced, but clearly there are people who are interested in what their party, what their constituency is going to want.
It's not like it's rampant across the country. There have been 28 of these judicial overrides in the past 16 years. 26 of them have come from Alabama. And the Supreme Court,
again, Mark, just for me, why go through a charade if the judge is going to decide life or death on his own, and why even have a jury?
Because the Supreme Court says that the states have freedom and discretion to enact their own death penalty regimes, and the Supreme Court has said twice that this scheme is constitutional.
You do agree with me that it has reached farcical stages when the jury goes to deliberate and the judge has already made his mind up. That if they don't agree with him, he's going to do what he wants.
What if it were the other way? What if the shoe were on the other foot and the judge could exercise a power of mercy when the community is bloodthirsty? Look, here's the point about all this. We waste more time litigating the procedures about death penalty. Years and years and years of litigation. We're tinkering with the machinery of death. It's probably more cost effective to just get rid of the apparatus altogether.
I think we agree on that. All right, we want you at home to weigh in on the story, and head over to Facebook and Twitter and sound off on our question today. If victim families do not want the death penalty, should that matter to the jury who makes the final call? Okay, coming up next, everyone, a judge telling the MTA it must allow a big ad on the sides of buses that says, "Killing Jews is worship that draws us close to Allah." Obviously, many people upset about this, but where do we draw the line when it comes to posting things on public space? Stay with us.